Hi, everyone. I think people are slowly trickling back from lunch, but it's good as time as any to start our informal discussion, and people can feel free to come in and out as they see fit. Um, we have a discussion prompt about which I believe was on the slide, which is on what is unique to Barclay scholarship or what problems are unique to Barclay scholarship in terms, and this is intended to be pretty open-ended in terms of direction. They can be pedagogical problems, for example, similar to the discussion about how we convince students this is commonsensical, if it is, that we discussed yesterday, or it can be in terms of philosophical content or in terms of historical methodology. How does the methodology of doing history on history of philosophy on Berkeley differ from how it might be for other figures? So we're just going to open this up for informal discussion. Well, one thing I would observe to start is that, there's a very sort of a specific theological tradition that Barclay is trying to insert himself into, where he seems much more at pains to stay within the bounds of a certain theological structure than many of the other figures we might study. Although, obviously, as we've seen, there's ways in which it may involve radical departure. So that's one possible starting point.
So I actually wanted to discuss something different. So if anybody else has something to say in response to that, Todd, should go ahead with that.
No, I mean, go ahead.
Sure. Yeah. So this is with respect to Barclay Pedagogy. So my experience is about as limited as they come with respect to teaching Barclay. I merely gave a couple lectures a few terms ago in Corey Dyke's class at Western. And I found that generally, whether it be the students that I was lecturing to that day or even friends and family of mine that ask me about what I do research on, people seem to be really generally reluctant to hop on the Barclay train kind of through the principles, if that's what we're talking about, as soon as they understand kind of God's role to be just he who creates the outside world in our minds. They have a hard time grappling with that, and it seems to be like ad hoc to them and replacing matter for doing the same work. And getting over that stepping stone has always been kind of pernicious. It seems like they no longer want to play ball after we talk about that, right? So.
I mean, I think just like anything, you're going to get a very different response with different student population depending on where you are. Mm-hmm. Because what the dominant views or assumptions are, or what they're willing to take seriously, look really different. I do think, though, on the kind of thing you're talking about, that I find it helpful to start out with the problem about making sense of substratum. Mm-hmm. Right. So I'm looking at my desk, and there's the smoothness, and there's the blackness, and there's the rectangularity. And then allegedly there's this other thing, the desk itself, in addition to the smoothness, blackness, and rectangularity, the thing that has those features. Mm-hmm. And the kind of, if you start from the kind of difficulty of making sense of that, and then you go from there to what explains then why I have this consistent set of perceptions that tend to all go together? Well, at least that way, there's a lot of philosophy you can do before you get to God.
All right.
So if people tune out at God, it's not a total loss. Yeah. But also, I think look, lots of people, especially lots of people who live in 1710, already believe in God. Exactly. And then they believe in all this other stuff in addition. What useful work is all that other stuff doing for them?
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, certainly I totally understand. And I think in my experience, even whether it be with talking to students or family and friends about Barclay's views, I think they just also don't want to bite hook, line, and sinker for the inertness of matter, just generally on Barclay's view. And if they don't hop on board with that, they think that God is just filling the role that matter is supposed to, and then they hop off the train and throw up their hands. So I guess maybe my concern is if anybody has any insight how to really kind of boost and make more accessible Barclay's arguments for the inertness of matter and the impossibility of it being so.
Speaking of throwing your hands up, I see a few hands up in the participant list, but people should jump in whenever they see a good opportunity. Jan or Margaret?
I'll let Margaret go first.
Hey, thank you. I have a sort of completely different issue than the one that Ben just raised, because I think, I've been struggling with another problem, which is different from the problem which we have with lots and lots of historical, philosophical texts. That is, hey, this person is saying something really weird, and how do we get the students to kind of get on board? I think there's a particular problem with Barclay that comes about because he wrote two different books very close together in time on exactly the same subject. And I think for me, it's been a big struggle to figure out how to identify a clear sense of Barclay's argument line, given that he does it twice in two different ways. I think a lot of the time, what you end up doing is starting with the beginning of the principles and then leaping into three dialogues to kind of get some more jazzy stuff going. And I think that makes a big problem because you lose what's a very clear argument structure that Barclay provides in the principles. So I'm throwing this out as a matter that I've been trying to come to terms with, and if I just ask if anybody else has had similar worries. I mean, you sort of end up creating one book out of two, and that's not really a good thing to have done.
And even within those two books, you kind of often have a scattershot approach in terms of arguments.
So something that I've done, and this is partly like the unique structure of the curriculum at TCD, which is different than a typical American model. But we have all the students who are studying any philosophy at all do a 2-year history sequence. But we go through stuff really fast, right? In those, because we only have 11-week semesters. So we've got half a semester for 17th century and half a semester for 18th century. So in the big, when I teach the big 18th century class, we do dialogues and we do it in about 2 weeks, really fast to get the overview. And then the students who are one subject students who are studying just philosophy and nothing else, in second year, they have a great texts sequence. And I do a component with them, half a semester, 6 weeks, where we just read principles and nothing else very slowly. We don't even really do, I recommend some secondary literature for their papers, but there's no kind of assigned reading for seminar. And so we just like to get the overview of Barclay from dialogues and then spend 6 weeks very slowly reading principles.
And how do the students respond to the 6-week version?
It varies a lot from one year to another. I'm always surprised with these small seminars in the lower years, how different it can be from one year to the next. But I do find that I get some engagement and that I can get the students to do the careful analysis of the arguments. And because we're going slowly and very textually, we can do the okay, what premise are you actually rejecting, right? Where does this actually go wrong, kind of thing, and get that kind of engagement with the text.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I guess I'll chime in again. So I'm wondering about if it might just be a generally feasible pedagogical approach, say whether it be the 11-week or kind of the traditional American 14-week, what have you, and you only have some time allotted to Barclay to just not just use the dialogues exclusively. So I know, like in the Jessup and Luce tradition, you know, that it's just the principles is kind of the end all, and the dialogues themselves are kind of just to put in Margaret's words, just a way to kind of jazz it up. And you know, I found that people just generally kind of like the dialogue form. It's a little bit more witty or jazzy again, and it seems to keep people on board between the two differing perspectives in a more kind of accessible way. So.
Yeah, the reason I do it the way I do is that I think the dialogues is a really good text for beginners to be able to read through without too much guidance or help and like get the big picture. But I think the principles is a much better text for picking apart line by line and kind of finding what is every step in the argument and exactly how does it work and how would you go about getting out of it if you wanted to.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So just to jump in from my experience, I actually think I've had trouble teaching the dialogues to intro level students. They seem to like the dialogues. They seem to enjoy the sort of wittiness of it, but they don't understand it. And I find it's actually easier to teach the arguments out of the principles because you can find the arguments. They're not couched in all of this bluster, and so I don't know if that's relevant, but that's I've actually leaned towards just teaching the principles.
I do really like the principles just for its straightforward polemical thrust. I mean, the fun thing for me though is that, you know, Benjamin asked this question earlier, and how the question is sort of how do you get people to set aside their presuppositions and just face Barclay head on? And you kind of have to do it the same way you would do anything like Spinoza or Leibniz or Bale. I mean, anytime you're going to present something that is just as radical as Barclay, you have to start off by just saying, look, this issue about questions about the nature of perception, questions about the nature of reality, questions about the nature of fundamental features that we take for granted, like the existence of matter and what the nature of matter is, are not issues that are settled. You might feel comfortable with thinking that the world is the way it appears to be, but it's not obvious that any of that is true. And then you just say, give Barclay the benefit of addressing some really deep and enduring questions, and forget that you have this allegiance to physical nature, and start reading them and see if he solves any of these problems for you.
That's helpful. I like that. Thank you. Yeah.
I just had another thought. I had another thought on Benjamin's question. I was reflecting on how I teach Barclay, and I find that it's often quite different than the way I teach other philosophers. When I'm teaching someone like Descartes, I want to, sort of draw them through the argument, lay it out very, nice and structurally, and give all the pieces and then show how all the pieces fit together. But when I teach Barclay, it's more like a challenge to the students. I tell them more or less, you all think this is stupid. You all think this is just wildly wrong. Prove it to me. And so it's more of a challenge to the students. And I find that the students get really worked up when you present it like that. You're like, here's this obviously false, I pitch it like this, here's this obviously false view. Tell me why it's obviously false. And then as a challenge, they see something there. I'm not trying to convince them of something. They're trying to convince me of something. And I think the way of teaching Barclay is sort of unique like that.
I like that. Yeah, thank you.
One of the other things I like about starting with dialogues, especially for the beginners, and this is in, they've already done 6 weeks of 17th century and they're getting into the 18th century, so we've seen all the Descartes and stuff, is, putting a lot of emphasis on how Barclay starts from, I'm saying that the stuff you perceive by your senses is real, right? And I have a little bit of an unfair advantage because he's the hometown hero, but I love the bit from the notebooks that says, there are some who would persuade us the wall is not white, the fire is not hot, etc. We Irishmen cannot attain to these truths, right? And I like, because it says, it's sort of pointing out the ways in which that Cartesian mechanistic picture is uncommonsensical, right? And then you're kind of asking, what if you thought this was the most important part of common sense, right? That this was the core thing that you really had to preserve, is that the wall is white, the fire is hot, the things you perceive immediately by your senses are the real things. What would it look like to build your worldview up from that? And then trying to see why it might end up looking like Barclay, and why you might think that all that material substratum stuff is interfering with the kind of, the trustworthiness of the senses and the reality of what you perceive.
That's appropriately contextualist, which of course we've all been taught is the way to approach an historical text rather than throwing them into the deep end.
Mm.
In my case, for example, teaching Barclay in Mexico is probably could be quite different than in other countries. Well, Mexico and in Spanish-speaking countries, because it's more or less the same. And my main challenge I face is, the first is when they heard the word Bishop Barclay. Immediately, in the public universities, which are all secular, when they hear, bishop, philosophy, no, something is bad here. And secondly is, when they hear that, is that guy who denies matter? Yeah, that guy. No, it's not possible. So both are the main challenge that I face. So it's the first week is try to say, okay, yeah, you heard some things, but most of them are not necessarily true. So, relax, chill out, and we try to learn. So, and in our case, for example, we study the bachelor is 5 years of philosophy, but it doesn't exist something like major philosophy or minor or something like that. In Spanish-speaking countries, all of them are just 5 years of philosophy or 5 years of sociology or 5 years of anthropology or something like that. So more or less, early modern philosophy is in the middle of the major, the third year, more or less. And Barclay is, as always, is in the middle of Locke and Hume. So it's another problem because most of the students are more familiar with this rationalist tradition. So they are not always sympathetic with this empiricism, and mostly with Barclay. So probably it's different in other countries, but in my case, and I think in Spanish-speaking countries, is the main challenge.
Along that line, as far as the teaching it as an extension of in British empiricism or people more familiar with the rationalist tradition, I mean, for all the things that Luce got wrong, I think he was, basically right that the influence of Malebranche is way at the time was way underappreciated as sort of an avenue into Barclay. And so I guess I'm curious if people have had more success with Barclay if they've taught Malebranche first, or more success with Barclay if they've taught Locke first.
That's how I do it, actually. So I have the luxury, I guess I'm the anti-Kenny Pierce, that I'm in an American school and we separate 17th and 18th century. And so there are standalone classes for the major. And so I start 18th century with Locke and Malebranche. And then we do 4.5 weeks on Barclay, Hume, Kant. And by the time we get to Kant, Barclay's looking pretty sweet, my students. They're prepared. They think that the refutation of idealism fails. They understand that we're connected directly to God in perception. They're just on board with all of that. What I was surprised from what folks were saying, do you not do the introduction of the principles first? Do you guys just start with paragraph 1? Because I think you have to start with the introduction.
You have to start with the introduction of the principles because that's where some of his beefiest arguments are.
Absolutely. And actually, I think the dialogues are hard to read and teach without knowing his views on language. Some of that stuff that's going on in the first dialogue, yeah.
Definitely glad to hear that. Anything that makes language sound more important is good for me.
Oh, shoot, nuts. So yeah, I do recommend situating things with here's what Barclay sees himself as responding to.
Right. Yeah, so just to clarify something, I've never taught a full course or a full lesson on Barclay. It was just a few lectures, nor have I done just the principles, anything like that. But in my experience, people do typically start with the introduction to the principles. And although despite learning Barclay's case against abstract general ideas and how he would want to categorize inconceivable matter into being such a thing, they feel the same about God. It's just kind of this disposition that they don't want to shrug off, I guess, and that's been my biggest hurdle. Yeah, thank you.
In line with the idea that it's like kind of hard to understand a lot of what Barclay is doing without understanding his view of language. At the risk of continuing in the direction of making all the things in Barclay about language, I think one thing that separates Barclay from a lot of the other early moderns in terms of how we think of his philosophy as a system is that the philosophy of language and the philosophy of science are like, well, this is controversial, but almost the same thing insofar as if nature is a language, then natural science is, well, it's a philosophy of language, it's a semantic apparatus, and that's not a merging of subdomains that really shows up in any other early moderns I can think of.
Maybe a little bit in Bacon, right? Where who's thinking, well, and the metaphor, of course, is prominent in Galileo, but for him it's a metaphor. But Bacon a bit talks about science as like deciphering a code, right? So the sensible qualities are like a kind of code that we're trying to decipher.
Remind me to send you what I've written recently about where I argue part of the reason for revisions in the revisions to the principles is because Barclay was reading Bacon in the interim.
There's some stuff that's great. There's some stuff from Bacon, some references in that Miscellanea Mathematica. The little Latin text from like 1707 or something. There's some Bacon references, as well as the speak with the vulgar bit, of course, is a Bacon quote.
Yeah.
So I do think that's a kind of neglected, underexplored bit of context to Barclay.
Yeah, remind me to pass along what I have on that at some
Absolutely.
point.
Yeah.
So I'd like to throw something out at you guys. And to switch the topic a bit, move away from teaching and think more about research and scholarship. And I'd like to know if anyone feels hindered or hampered by the fact that the only critical edition is Jessup Luce. Luce Jessup is a highly defective edition. It's been around for God knows 60 years, and I'm a little surprised we don't have a better edition. We usually work out of student editions. Does anyone find that to be problematic? And thanks.
Puzzling as well. It's problematic. Why hasn't anybody done this yet?
I mean, I can speak from my own experience that, whether it's, a conference call for papers, whatever it is, and one of the caveats for submission is that everything has to be referenced to the Jessup Luce editions. I don't have easy access to that. It takes me forever after I've written a whole piece, referencing whichever, to go back and get it done. So I can say that much on my own behalf.
Weren't there
Isn't there a
rumors
new
going
critical
around?
edition from Belfraga coming out?
Yeah, that was what I was going to mention as well.
Does anybody know how?
I don't know at what
More
stage
than a
it's at.
rumor?
I heard about it 2 years ago that it was happening, but I don't know if they've taken steps.
I don't think even the queerest text that was like finished has even been published. But he did have a text of the queerest that he was circulating in PDFs that was, quite robust critical edition that had all the comparisons of all the, variants and so forth, circulated in PDF, but I don't think even that's been published.
Well, I guess you have to begin somewhere.
Yeah.
Well, that's actually just about the time we have for sort of our informal discussion. I want to thank everyone for joining in. We have 5-minute break, and then we're going to have a talk by Benjamin immediately after. So hopefully we'll see you all in 5 minutes, and we can continue the discussion.